Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast.
The night they sealed away the Bone Witch, the fog ran red. Now, there's something to send shivers down your spine on this mid-January day, if the chilly weather hasn't already done so. It's the opening line of today's first story, so you know what you might be in for. We're following on from the concept of our Live and Spooky podcast takeover last year, if you listened in, and we're going to be spotlighting more of our new fiction titles in Season 2 of the Myth and Fiction podcast. In this episode, we are casting the light on our upcoming anthology, Witchcraft Short Stories, which is part of our Beyond and Within series. This one is coming out on the 20th of January, so we're actually giving you a sneak peek at something that hasn't even been published yet. Witchcraft is an anthology of horror stories exploring basically what it means to be a witch, including the rediscovery and the reclaiming of that power, its links to nature, and, of course, witchcraft mythology from all around the world. Friends of the podcast and award-winning authors and anthologists Marie O'Regan and Paul Kane are co-editors of this book, and they've chosen an outstanding selection of tales, so that made our job very easy. We were absolutely spoilt for choice with which story to read. We've ultimately decided to read What Bones Remember by Buhlebethu Mpofu to appear in today's episode. It's an atmospheric folk horror story that fundamentally explores the duality of good versus evil, as all the great stories do. It also offers a fresh spin on Baba Yaga, a witch-like character from Slavic folklore, sometimes described as a repulsive old woman who fries and eats children, sometimes as a nice old woman who helps the hero. To introduce this story and the whole anthology to you all, we've got a message from the editors, Marie O'Regan and Paul Kane.
Hi, I'm Marie O'Regan.
And I'm Paul Kane.
We're the editors of Beyond and Within Witchcraft, which features the story What Bones Remember by Buhlebethu, Sukoluhle, Mpofu, and apologies if I've mispronounced any of that. It was part of the blind submissions we received and caught our eye straight away. It's a Baba Yaga story, which we didn't have at that point, but it's also a very unusual take on that subject and very well written, which is something we always look for when picking a story.
I was attracted to the zombie elements, not technically zombies, but as anyone knows me, knows my love of that particular subgenre. This one has an element of controlling the dead as well, which appealed to me. Being in charge of that power, the ultimate power really over life and death, actually.
It also likens power to hunger. Some of our greatest stories have been about the pursuit of that, how it literally, in this case, changes someone, and about the price it demands.
I also like the way that it handles how we fight that and what it takes. In a way, you're addressing addiction, how you can't tackle that alone, how you might need the help of other people to get you through it, to come back to realising who you really are.
Finally, this had everything a good witchcraft story needs. A grimoire, a mythology of its own rather than the retread of existing folklore, the empowerment of women, sisterhood, a misunderstanding of what that actually is by the outside world. There are elements of folk horror too, which was the last Beyond and Within anthology we did. So without any further ado, we'll let you get on and enjoy a terrific story, What Bones Remember.
And now for the story. This is What Bones Remember, read by Amanda Benzacree.
What Bones Remember by Buhlebethu, Sukoluhle, Mpofu. The night they sealed away the Bone Witch, the fog ran red. Elena's grandmother had told her this story 100 times before she died, each telling different, yet the same. How the village's children had started disappearing first, their small bones found weeks later, arranged in complicated patterns in the deep woods. How the dead began to walk, not as mindless creatures, but as terrible puppets with 2 bright eyes and voices that spoke of things no living person should know. How Yaga, once the village's most respected healer, had transformed from protector to monster, her power growing until she could command armies of the dead with a single gesture. But why? Young Elena had always asked, and her grandmother's face would tighten, the scar along her throat gleaming silver in the firelight. The scar that all the women in their family bore was a mark that appeared on their 16th birthday, like a brand from within. Power, she would say, is like hunger. The more you feed it, the more it wants. Then she would touch her scar, a gesture Elena's mother Raina made too, though neither would ever explain its meaning. The last time Elena's grandmother told the story, the night before she died, she had said something different. Her eyes had been fever bright, her words urgent. She is still there in the circle, waiting. The stones hold her, but the stones crack. Blood calls to blood, and power to power. She had gripped Elena's wrist with surprising strength. Promise me you will stay away when the calling comes. Promise me you will not answer. But Elena had not promised, and her grandmother had died that night, her last breath carrying a word that made the candles flicker. Yaga. 10 years later, Elena traced her fingers over the worn carvings in her mother's grimoire, remembering. The candlelight cast strange shadows across the ancient pages, making the ink appear to writhe and shift. Years ago she had memorized every page of this book, helping her mother with simple healing spells and protective charms. But tonight, the book had fallen open to a page she had never seen before, the parchment darker and older than the rest. The writing was different here, not her mother's neat hand or her grandmother's flowing script, but something older, the letters sharp and angular like broken bones. Diagrams showed human figures with their skin peeled back, revealing intricate patterns of muscle and sinew. Notes in the margins spoke of death, resurrection, and power drawn from marrow and bone. One word stood out clearly, repeated like a chant. Yaga. You should not be reading that. Elena slammed the book shut, her heart hammering. Her mother, Raina, stood in the doorway, her face drawn with the same worry Elena remembered from her grandmother's tale. The lines around her eyes seemed more profound than usual, and her ordinarily steady hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. I want to understand, Elena said, lifting her chin. Why do they call us witches behind our backs? Why do you pretend we are nothing more than herbalists, when we both know there is more to our power? The memory of last week's incident hung between them unspoken. How a young Thomas, barely 6, had fallen from the mill roof and stopped breathing. How his mother had screamed and screamed until the sound drew half the village. Elena had pushed through the crowd, drawn by something she could not name, and placed her hands on his chest. She had felt something answer then, a pulse of power that had nothing to do with the herbs and poultices her mother had taught her to use. For a moment she had seen Thomas balanced on a threshold, his small spirit wavering between here and elsewhere. She had reached out and pulled him back, but not before glimpsing what lay beyond. A vast darkness filled with hungry eyes and reaching hands. Not before feeling something in that darkness notice her in return. The boy gasped and opened his eyes, but the villagers' gratitude was tinged with fear. When they thought she could not hear, they whispered about how no one should have such power over death, how it was not natural, and how Yaga had started the same way. Raina crossed the room and took the grimoire, her fingers brushing against Elena's as she did. A spark of energy passed between them, making them both flinch. Because some kinds of power come with too high a price. She tucked the book into her apron pocket. Yaga learnt that too late. She was like us once, a healer, a protector. But she wanted more. She thought she could control death itself. What happened to her? Though Elena knew the story, she had never heard it from her mother's lips, had never dared to ask about the scar they would share. The village elders sealed her away, but not before. Raina stopped, her hand going to her throat where the thin scar traced its way down to her collarbone. The same scar Elena's grandmother had borne, the same scar that would mark Elena's own throat on her 16th birthday. Promise me you will stay away from the stone circle, Elena. Some doors should not be opened. But what if I need to know? Elena pressed. What if the power is already in me? Last week with Thomas. That was different. Raina snapped. That was healing. What Yaga did, what she became. She shuddered. The power to heal and corrupt come from the same source, child. The difference lies in how far you are willing to reach and what price you will pay. That night, as the fog rolled in thick enough to blot out the stars, Elena entered the forest. The trees seemed to lean away from her path, their branches creaking in the stillness. Shadows moved between the trunks, and more than once she thought she saw pale faces peering from behind the bark, gone when she looked directly at them. The stone circle lay behind a thicket of thorns, which had not been there that morning. The brambles tore at Elena's dress and scratched her hands as she forced her way through, drawing tiny beads of blood that seemed to sink into the hungry earth. Each drop made the ground pulse with a sickly light, like a heart beating beneath the soil. The stones themselves were ancient, half buried in earth but still standing. 9 of them, arranged in a perfect circle, each carved with runes that pulsed with a faint, unholy light. Elena recognized some from her mother's grimoire, symbols for binding, sealing, and holding back what should not be freed. But others were stranger, older, their meanings lost to time. As she stepped into the circle, the air grew thick and heavy, tasting of copper and rot. The fog swirled around Elena's ankles like hungry tongues, and she could have sworn she heard whispers in a language too old for any human speech to utter. Something gleamed at the circle's centre, a delicate and translucent bone pulsing with its inner light. It called her with a voice that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her blood. She had been looking for this all her life, though she had not known it until now. The bone sang to her of power, not the gentle healing magic Elena sometimes felt when helping her mother, but something more profound, older. It promised answers to questions she had not even known to ask, about why her family's women bore the same scar, generation after generation, about why the villagers came to them for healing, but crossed themselves when they passed. Why sometimes, when she touched a dying thing, she could feel the moment when life became death, and she could sense the threshold between worlds. Elena's hand trembled as she reached for it. The moment her fingers closed around the bone, power surged through her body, ancient, hungry, and absolute. It felt like being cut open from the inside, like something was trying to hollow her out to make room for itself, like death was trying to wear her skin. The bone burned cold in her palm before rising of its own accord, floating upward to her neck, where it pressed against her throat and began to sink into her flesh, forming a macabre pendant. "Foolish child." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that spoke of grave dirt and forgotten things. "You have opened what was sealed. You have claimed what was never meant to be yours." The power burned through her veins like ice, and Elena screamed. But the fog swallowed the sound until it was lost in the hungry dark. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer alone in her mind. Something old, patient, and terribly aware had awakened, and it wore her grandmother's scar around its throat. In the village below, the long dead stirred in their graves, remembering what it was to hunger, and in the darkness behind Elena's eyes, Yaga began to smile. The changes came in whispers at first. Dreams plagued Elena's sleep, memories that were not hers, of power that turned healing into corruption, life into death. She saw through Yaga's eyes as villages burned, as armies of the dead marched across fields that withered at their touch. She felt the intoxication of such power, the way it had transformed Yaga from healer to horror. Worse, she felt how right it had seemed, how natural the progression from preserving life to commanding death. They never understood. Yaga's voice whispered in her mind. The dead are more faithful than the living. They do not question. They do not betray. They simply serve. Elena would wake to find dirt under her fingernails, her feet muddy from walking in her sleep. Her bedsheets were stained with earth and something darker, and she tried not to examine them too closely. Sometimes she found herself in the graveyard at dawn, unsure how she had gotten there, her hands raw from digging. The dead called to her now, their bones singing beneath the earth. They remembered Yaga, remembered how she had pulled them from their rest to serve her will. Now they stirred again, reaching through soil and stone toward her presence. She could feel them all, every corpse, every skeleton, every fragment of bone in the village grounds. They whispered their names to her, begged to be awakened, to serve once more. Young Thomas had also been changed by his brush with death. Since the day Elena had pulled him back from the threshold, he sensed things others could not. He would stare at shadows where no shadows should be, his eyes tracking invisible movements. Sometimes he would speak in a voice that was too old for his years, describing things no child should know. "The dead lady says you are changing," he told Elena one day, his small face serious. "She says you are becoming like her, but different too, stronger." When Elena asked which dead lady, He pointed to empty air and said, "The one with the bone crown, the one who wears your face in the other world." Her mother noticed the changes first. Raina watched with growing horror as dark veins spread beneath Elena's skin, pulsing with a sickly green light. Early, the scar that should have marked Elena's 16th birthday appeared, carved from within by unseen hands. It wept black blood that moved of its own accord. "Fight it," Raina whispered, pressing sachets of protective herbs into Elena's hands. The herbs blackened and crumbled at her touch. "You are stronger than she is. You have to be." But Elena was not sure who she was anymore. When she looked in mirrors, her reflection showed two faces superimposed, her own and another's, beautiful and terrible, with eyes that held centuries of hunger. Her hair had begun to streak with white, and her teeth ached as if trying to reshape themselves into something sharper. A sense of profound dread settled over the village. Fear did not begin to describe it. It was deeper, older, a kind of terror born from an instinct too primal to be understood. The villagers pressed themselves into their homes, hearts thundering in their chests, bodies trembling with a cold sweat. Livestock began to die mysteriously, their bodies twisted as if they had tried to reshape themselves before death. Gardens withered overnight, the earth turning black and corrupt. Children woke screaming about fingers tapping at their windows, about dead relatives calling their names, about a woman with white-streaked hair and burning eyes who visited their dreams and offered them power. The villagers felt the presence of something other that did not belong, and they knew, without being told, that this was not the kind of fear they could outrun. The first to rise was old Marek, who had died these 2 months. He pulled himself up from the grave like a marionette with knotted strings, skin stretched taut over stricken bone. Yaga's power, now also Elena's, drew him from his rest, gaping mouth wailing a wordless scream. More came, men, women, children, their bodies writhing in ways the living were never meant to. The dead did not simply rise. They were transformed. Birds flying over the village suddenly had their wings twisted and broken, plummeting from the sky as they fell. Feathers and bone fragments rained down upon the ground below. Horses dragged themselves on shattered legs, their bodies contorted into impossible shapes. Even the smallest creatures were not spared. Mice and rats with exposed bones still scurrying, cats with rotting flesh still stalking their prey. To the villagers, Elena had become nothing but a living curse, a walking reminder of the Bone Witch's dark reign. They discussed her in scared voices, considering what should be done. Some said she should be cast out or executed, that just by existing she was a threat to all of them. Others were wary, having no desire to incur a wrath that would outstrip even the severity of their punishment. And so the villagers did nothing, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. They avoided her when they could, their gazes dropping as she walked by, their bodies stiff with the effort it took to suppress their trembling. To speak to her felt like inviting doom. To touch her was unthinkable. Elena began to lose time. She would find herself in strange places, surrounded by evidence of things she could not remember doing. Once, she woke in old Martha's cottage to see the dead woman teaching her how to read the future in scattered bones. Another time, she became aware in the church that the holy water was boiling in its font, and Latin prayers were reversed and reformed into necromantic chants. The bone fused to her neck grew warmer and hungrier. At times it pulsed beneath her skin, sinking deeper before emerging elsewhere on her body, reshaping her from the inside out. Her teeth fell out one night and were replaced by sharper ones. Her fingers lengthened, joints appearing like new branches growing on a dead tree. Beautiful. Yaga spoke in hushed tones as Elena examined her changing reflection. We are becoming what we were always meant to be, a perfect fusion of death and life, of ending and beginning. The dead themselves began to change as well. The first risings had been simple reanimations, but now they showed terrible creativity. Old Marek's body sprouted new limbs made of grave moss and bone. Martha's form became a twisted sinew lattice housing a poisonous fungi garden. The dead animals merged into chimeric forms that defied natural law. But what happened to Sarah, Elena's childhood friend, marked the point of no return. Sarah had been dead for 3 years, taken by fever, and Elena had thought her grief long settled. Then one night, Sarah stepped out of the shadows in Elena's room, her body a masterwork of death's artistry. Fungal blooms sprouted from her eye sockets, spreading patterns like delicate lace across her skin. Her bones had reformed into spiral patterns visible beneath translucent flesh, and when she moved, it was with a dancer's terrible grace. "We have missed you, Elena," Sarah said. But it was not only Sarah's voice. Other voices spoke with her, a chorus of the dead. "We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who understands that death is not an ending, but a transformation." Elena's mother found them at dawn, surrounded by a court of the dead. Sarah was braiding Elena's hair with grave flowers and bones, whispering secrets of the tomb, while other corpses danced in slow circles around them. Raina's scream of horror broke the scene, sending the dead skittering back to their graves, all except Sarah, who smiled with 2 sharp teeth before melting into the shadows. "What have you done?" Raina whispered, her hand at her throat where her scar pulsed in sympathy with her daughter's. "What have you become?" But Elena did not have an answer. She was not sure there was an I anymore to become anything. She was a vessel for something older, that remembered when the boundary between life and death was more permeable, when power flowed across that threshold. The dead brought her gifts now, secret things they had taken to their graves, forgotten magics and ancient knowledge. They taught her how to read the language of decay and reshape death into new life forms. Under their tutelage, guided by Yaga's whisperings, she learned to craft beauty from corruption and to find power in putrefaction. "Your mother's teachings are half measures," Yaga told her as they worked. "She heals the body but ignores the soul. We understand deeper truths. Life and death are clay in our hands. waiting to be reshaped. The village became a gallery of their artistry. Beautiful, terrible things bloomed in the shadows. The dead rose and fell like tides, each resurrection more elaborate than the last. The living walked carefully, knowing they were no longer their home's dominant species. But power, as Alina's grandmother had warned, was like hunger, and hunger, given time, consumes everything, even the one who feeds it. As Alina felt herself slipping further into Yaga's embrace, a small part of her, the part that still remembered healing Thomas, still loved her mother, still grieved for Sarah, knew that soon there would be no turning back. Raina found her in the graveyard that night, surrounded by her court of the dead. Raina carried the grimoire in her hands, her scar blazing with silver light. "There is still time," she said. "The choice is not made until you let it be made." But Yaga's laughter echoed in Alina's mind. "Choice? There was never any choice, child. This power is your birthright. Look at your mother. She bears our mark, but cowers from her true nature. Will you be as weak?" The dead stirred restlessly around them. Sarah's skeletal hand rested on Alina's shoulder, her touch both comforting and terrible. Through the fog, more shapes approached, every corpse in the village cemetery rising to witness this moment. "You are wrong," Raina said, her voice steady despite her fear. "There is always a choice. Why do you think we bear these scars? They are not Yaga's mark. They are wounds from fighting her. Every generation she tries to return, every generation one of us must choose to stand against her." The truth hit Alina like a physical blow. She saw it then, her grandmother's last words, her mother's constant vigilance, the power that had always flowed through their bloodline. They were not Yaga's descendants. They were her wardens. "Lies!" Yaga hissed through Alina's mouth. "They are jealous of our power. Together we could reshape death itself, make it beautiful, make it serve us." But something had changed. In Raina's words, Alina found an anchor to her old self. She looked at her creations, the twisted dead, the corrupted earth, the darkness she had thought so beautiful, and saw them through unclouded eyes. She reached for the bone at her throat, now fused with her flesh. With a scream that shattered the headstones, she tore it free. Blood that moved like quicksilver poured from the wound. "No!" Yaga's voice was thunder and breaking bones. The dead convulsed, their forms twisting as the witch fought to maintain control. "You cannot deny what you are." "I know exactly what I am," Alina said. She took the grimoire from her mother, her blood staining its pages. "I am my mother's daughter. I am a healer, and you have corrupted your last generation." The final battle was fought in blood, bone, and memory. Alina felt Yaga trying to hollow her out, to take complete control. But each assault she countered with memories of healing. Thomas's first breath, her mother's gentle teachings, even Sarah's genuine smile before death had claimed her. The bone in her hand grew hot, trying to burrow back into her flesh. She fought through the pain, through the seductive whispers of power, through the grief of letting go of what she could have become. With her mother's help, she spoke the words her grandmother had used that every generation of their family had passed down. Yaga's scream echoed across the world. The dead collapsed, truly lifeless once more. The fog lifted, and the moon shone down on a graveyard where nothing stirred. When it was over, Elena knelt in the cold earth, her mother's arms around her. Her throat bled from a new scar, not the mark of Yaga's power, but a badge of victory, of choice. "It is not over," she said, touching the wound. "She will try again." Yes. Raina helped her daughter stand. But that is why we are here, to make the choice, repeatedly, until the world forgets her name. Together they began healing what Yaga's power had corrupted. It would take time, but that was what their family did best. Heal, protect, remember. And if sometimes, in her dreams, Elena still heard Yaga's whispers, she knew now how to answer. She was a witch, yes, but she had chosen what kind of witch to be.
I know that Elena triumphs over Yaga's evil, but there is still this overwhelming sense of her unrelenting power and its potential for corruption that really gives this story a very uneasy feeling when you read it. Our next story is quite simply called The Witch. It's an original folkloric tale from Russia, which reads more like a familiar fairy tale. It's been borrowed from our 2020 collection, Witches, Wizards, Seers and Healers Myths Tales. And this was actually one of the first stories that we recorded for the podcast way back at the beginning of 2025, but we hadn't really found the right story to pair with it. Our intention behind this particular pairing was to sort of show the traditional and somewhat one-dimensional portrayals of witches from the past, and contrast that with the more layered and empathetic ones of today. But this story does similarly contain the gripping gothic elements, and the epic battles between good versus evil that make witch stories so enchanting. So anyway, here is The Witch, read by B.
The Witch, from the Witches, Wizards, Seers and Healers, Myths and Tales. Once upon a time, there was a peasant whose wife died, leaving him with 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl. For some years, the poor man lived on alone with the children, caring for them as best he could. But everything in the house seemed to go wrong without a woman to look after it, and at last he made up his mind to marry again, feeling that a wife would bring peace and order to his household and take care of his motherless children. So he married, and in the following years several children were born to him. But peace and order did not come to the household, for the stepmother was very cruel to the twins, and beat them and half-starved them and constantly drove them out of the house. For her, one idea was to get them out of the way. All day she thought of nothing but how she should get rid of them, and at last an evil idea came to her head, and she determined to send them out into the great gloomy wood where a wicked witch lived. And so one morning she spoke to them, saying, "You have been such good children that I am going to send you to visit my granny, who lives in a dear little hut in the wood. You will have to wait upon her and serve her, but you will be well rewarded, for she will give you the best of everything." So the children left the house together, and the little sister, who was very wise for her years, said to the brother, "We will first go and see our own dear grandmother, and tell her where our stepmother is sending us." And when the grandmother heard where they were going, she cried and said, "You poor motherless children! How I pity you, and yet I can do nothing to help you. Your stepmother is not sending you to her granny, but to a wicked witch who lives in that great gloomy wood. Now listen to me, children. You must be civil and kind to everyone, and never say a cross word to anyone, and never touch a crumb belonging to anyone else. Who knows if after all help may not be sent to you." And she gave her grandchildren a bottle of milk, and a piece of ham and a loaf of bread, and they set out for the great gloomy wood. When they reached it, they saw in front of them, in the thickest of trees, a queer little hut, and when they looked into it, there lay a witch, with her head on the threshold of the door, with one foot in one corner and the other in the other corner, and her knees cocked up, almost touching the ceiling. "Who's there?" she snarled in an awful voice when she saw the children, and they answered civilly, though they were so terrified that they hid behind one another and said, "Good morning, Granny. Our stepmother has sent us to wait upon you and serve you." "See that you do it well, then," growled the witch, "and if I am pleased with you, I'll reward you, but if I am not, I'll put you in a pan and fry you in the oven. That's what I'll do with you, my pretty dears. You have been gently reared, but you'll find my work is hard enough. See if you don't." And so saying, she set the girl down to spin yarn, but she gave the boy a sieve in which to carry water from the well, and she herself went out into the wood. Now as the girl was sitting at her distaff, weeping bitterly because she could not spin, she heard the sound of hundreds of little feet, and from every hole and corner in the hut mice came pattering along the floor, squeaking and saying, "Little girl, why are your eyes so red? If you want help, then give us some bread." And the girl gave them bread that her grandmother had given her. Then the mice told her that the witch had a cat, and the cat was very fond of ham. If she would give the cat her ham, it would show her the way out of the wood, and in the meantime they would spin the yarn for her. So the girl set out to look for the cat, and as she was hunting about, she met her brother, in great trouble because he could not carry water from the well in a sieve, as it came pouring out as fast as he put it in. And as she was trying to comfort him, they heard a rustling of wings, and a flight of wrens alighted on the ground beside them. And the wren said, "Give us some crumbs, then you need not grieve, for you'll find that the water will stay in the sieve." Then the twins crumbled their bread on the ground, and the wrens pecked it, and chirruped and chirped. And when they had eaten the last crumb, they told the boy to fill up the holes of the sieve with clay, and then to draw water from the well. So he did what they said, and carried the sieve full of water into the hut without spilling a drop. When they entered the hut, the cat was curled up upon the floor, so they stroked her and fed her with ham, and said to her, "Pussy, grey pussy, tell us how we are to get away from the witch." Then the cat thanked them for the ham, and gave them a pocket handkerchief and a comb, and then told them that when the witch pursued them, as she certainly would, all they had to do was to throw the handkerchief on the ground and run as fast as they could. As soon as the handkerchief touched the ground, a deep, broad river would spring up, which would hinder the witch's progress. If she managed to get across it, they must throw the comb behind them and run for their lives, for where the comb fell, a dense forest would start up, which would delay the witch for so long that they would be able to get away safely. The cat had scarcely finished speaking when the witch returned to see if the children had fulfilled their tasks. "Well, you have done well enough for today," she grumbled, "but tomorrow you'll have something more difficult to do, and if you don't do it well, you pampered brats, straight in the oven you'll go." Half dead with fright and trembling in every limb, the poor children lay down to sleep on a heap of straw in the corner of the hut, but they dared not close their eyes, and scarcely ventured to breathe. In the morning, the witch gave the girl 2 pieces of linen to weave before night, and the boy a pile of wood to cut into chips. Then the witch left them to their tasks, and went into the wood. As soon as she had gone out of sight, the children took the comb and the handkerchief, and taking one another by a hand, they started, and ran and ran and ran. And first they met the watchdog, who was going to leap on them and tear them to pieces, but they threw the remains of their bread to him, and he ate them and wagged his tail. Then they were hindered by the birch trees, whose branches almost put their eyes out. But the little sister tied the twigs together with a piece of ribbon, and they got past safely, and after running through the wood, came out onto the open fields. In the meantime, the cat was busy weaving the linen and the tangled threads as it wove, and the witch returned to see how the children were getting on, and she crept up to the window and whispered, "Are you weaving, my little dear?" "Yes, Granny, I'm weaving," answered the cat. When the witch saw that the children had escaped her, she was furious, and hitting the cat with a porringa, she said, "Why did you let the children leave the hut? And why did you not scratch their eyes out?" But the cat curled up its tail and put its back up and answered, "I have served you all these years, and you never even thrown me a bone, but the dear children gave me their own piece of ham. Then the witch was furious with the watchdog and with the birch trees, because they had let the children pass, but the dog answered, "I have served you all these years, and you have never given me so much as a hard crust, but the dear children gave me a loaf of bread." And the birch rustled its leaves and said, "I have served you longer than I can say, and you have never tied a bit of twine even round my branches, and the dear children bound them up with their brightest ribbons." So the witch saw that there was no help to be got from her old servants, and the best thing she could do was to mount on her broom and set off in pursuit of the children. And as the children ran, they heard the sound of the broom sweeping on the ground close behind them. So instantly they threw the handkerchief down over their shoulder, and in a moment a broad, deep river flowed behind them. When the witch came up to it, it took her a long time before she found a place she could ford over on her broomstick, but at last she got across, and continued the chase faster than before. And as the children ran, they heard a sound, and the little sister put her ear to the ground and heard the broom sweeping the earth close behind them. So quick as a thought, she threw the comb down on the ground, and in an instant, as the cat had said, a dense forest sprung up, in which the roots and branches were so closely intertwined that it was impossible to force a way through it. So when the witch came up to it on her broom, she found that there was nothing for it but to turn around and go back to her hut. But the twins ran straight on until they reached their home. Then they told their father all that they had suffered, and he was so angry with their stepmother that he drove her out of the house and never let her return. But he and the children lived happily together, and he took care of them himself and never let a stranger come near them.
To me, there is something about the January chill and the bare branches of the trees that sets the scenes for folk horror. So really, there is no better time to pick up a copy of Witchcraft short stories and explore a lot more mythology from around the world. A huge thank you to all of today's contributors and to all of our listeners. We will see you next week for another episode of the Myth and Fiction Podcast, Season 2.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction Podcast and look forward to the next episode. Do recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.